Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Chocolate Life Live. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host today, and I'm also the creator and the moderator of TheChocolateLife.com. It's an interesting topic today, I think, cocoa and climate change, because I think that underlying this question is a foundation which has an impact and effect on a lot of the other things that we discuss here on The Chocolate Life. But before we get into today's topic, we're just going to jump right into it. What I want to do is I want to share a little news that came up in the course of the last week. And that news is that Theo Chocolate, who's been around for nearly 2 decades, Theo Chocolate in Seattle announced in the last week or so that what it is doing is going to be merging. It's going to be merging with a company on the East Coast called American Licorice. And it's not exactly clear what merging means. It may be that American Licorice acquired outright all of the assets of Theo Chocolate. We're not quite certain what that means at the moment. I haven't read anything to give us the exact details with respect to finance and other aspects. What is most important, I think, for many people, especially people who are in the Seattle area, is that as a part of the merger, as a part of the restructuring, they're going to be closing down the Seattle manufacturing operation. So the factory in Seattle is going to be closing down. That probably won't happen until after the merger is finished, which is sometime Q3, but Q3 started 2 days ago. So it could be sometime in the next 90 days. The factory is going to be shutting down. They are going to be keeping the kitchen operation open and other aspects of the business in the Seattle area. But I think that one of the things that everybody really, really loved about being in Seattle and being a part of the craft chocolate scene was the presence of Theo Chocolate and the ability to go and take a tour at the factory. So it also remains uncertain at the moment as to where the chocolate that Theo is going to be selling is going to be manufactured and who is going to be doing the manufacturing. So as we learn more about that over the course of the coming weeks and months, I'm trying to see if I can get an interview with one of the principals at Theo now. The two founders, Deb Music and Joe Minnie, are no longer associated with the company directly. And so we need to go to current executives of the company to be able to find out the answers to that question. And with that, we're going to get into today's topic of cocoa and climate change. I want to remind everybody that if you're watching on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, wherever it is, go into the comments and let me know where you're connecting from, where in the world you're connecting from. Always like to know that. Give a shout out. I get it up on the screen. And of course, if you have comments and questions about today's topic, please let me know and I will jump into it. So a quick note, here is the homepage of the Chocolate Life right now. You can see there is a post right here in the top rail. There is a post for today's live stream, and I do a post for every live stream here on the Chocolate Life Live. You can go and you can click on that image, and what you'll do is you'll get to the page for this post. And the page for this post includes not only links to where you can watch things, but an overview of today's topic, and then a list of resources. Some of these resources, this list of resources will be updated over the course of the hour if there are things that are brought up that I need to add to this list. But it contains a bunch of resources that I use to put this together. There is a link right here. There's a link to a discussion over on LinkedIn. That discussion over on LinkedIn is I'm going to go to next. So what I do is I take today's topic, I go into my community on LinkedIn, my network on LinkedIn, and I ask them the question. And the question I asked in this episode is, does cocoa contribute to the problem of climate change? And if it does, how it does? And how can cocoa be a part of solutions to climate change if cocoa can be a solution to climate change? And here over at LinkedIn, I want to start here. You can see that is a long post. We get to a bunch of different places. There's a different image for this because I asked the question in a different post than I post around the live stream. But what I want to do is I want to start with a comment that was made by Anthony Fountain. And Anthony is someone I've met personally a number of occasions at conferences around the world, who's the managing director of something called the Voice Network, the voice of organizations in cocoa. And I wanted to start here because I think he is the one who starts to answer the problem or answer the question most directly and most completely in terms of framing the hour that we're going to go through. So Anthony says, yes, cocoa contributes to climate change unambiguously. He says there are two ways, two significant ways and one slightly less significant way. Okay. The first two are through deforestation, for which cocoa is a driver in virtually all of the cocoa countries where cocoa is produced. Now, it should be known here that while cocoa is a driver of cocoa change in many countries, it is not necessarily the most significant driver of deforestation in any of these countries. So it's just important to know that cocoa is one of a number of crops that contribute to deforestation in the countries where it's produced. So it turns out that cocoa grows best in tropical rainforests, and tropical rainforests are rain machines. When you cut down the rain machines, you directly influence weather patterns. So this is a reality in West Africa, where about 90% of old growth tropical forests have been cut down, largely for cocoa and other cash crop exports. Okay, it's important to know that other cash crop exports. So cocoa is a contributor among other crops to climate change. So in Brazil, for example, there are 200,000 hectare farms just of soybeans. So bang, complete slash and burn due to the ground, and this is all mechanized production. So bang, 200,000. There aren't any, to the best of my knowledge, 200,000 hectare square cocoa farms, but we do have this issue, right? But cash crops in one place. In other places, it's going to be sugar. Many other crops are involved, not just cocoa. So what this has done is caused significant changes in rainfall patterns, humidity, and temperatures. Absolutely. So tropical rainforests also store an incredible amount of carbon. They're the world's lungs, filtering out CO2 and giving us back oxygen. The carbon capture that an old growth forest is capable of dwarfs that of a mature cocoa plantation, let alone a freshly planted cocoa farm, right? And he makes a wonderful analogy. Like, do we have a little red golf cart, right? Would we expect it to go as fast as a Ferrari just because it has four wheels in the same color? And the obvious answer is no. We should not expect that to be the case. But it's important here to note that what Anthony is pointing out is he's pointing out about old growth forests. So these are forests that have been in existence before the arrival of Europeans, right, onto the continent some 550, 600 years ago, right? These are not necessarily the second growth forests as a result of human habitation, and it's certainly not anything which antedates modern industrial agricultural production. But it's really important here to know is about old growth forests, right? And so one of the questions people might ask is it possible to return any significant amount of agricultural lands to old growth forest? And how long would it take for that to happen? Okay, so lastly, in terms of chocolate contributing or cocoa and chocolate contributing to climate change, there's the carbon footprint in the transport and manufacturing of the chocolate. So absolutely, getting dried cocoa on the farm is just the start of the process. We need to get it from the farm to the port of export. We need to get it from the port of export to a port of import. Then we need to get it from there to the factory. And every single one of those is an extension of the carbon footprint, an expansion of the carbon footprint. And so any attempt to understand cocoa's and chocolate's contribution needs to understand all of these things. Now, I would go one step further than Anthony does here, is understand a couple of really important things. Number one is there are a lot of other things in the container with the cocoa. So what is the carbon footprint associated with the bags, either polypropylene or jute bags? all of those have their own waste streams. All of those have their own carbon footprints. So what is the footprint for the pallet if there's a wooden pallet inside, if there's dressing inside the container to reduce humidity and things like that. So we need to, when we think about climate change, it's not just the cocoa itself, it's all of the things around the cocoa that go into growing it and transporting it to wherever it's going to be transformed, and then the energy which is required to transform the cocoa into finished chocolate product. And then Anthony, in response to his own point, he says, yes, cocoa can be a part of the solution as well. And so he says, so this is an example that I want to point to, because this particular image on the top of this page, let me scroll and get you to that page. So the image on the top of this page here, right, is taken in the specific area of Ecuador that, so in the what's called the dry forest west of Guayaquil, where there were some old growth forests which were basically completely cut down for use for boat building, as well as to rebuild homes and business buildings in Guayaquil after some fires. And it resembles nothing like the old growth forest that was there before. Today, agriculture is only possible as a result of, or large scale agriculture is available only as a result of irrigation from a hydroelectric project, which was installed many years ago. But this is an example of a kind of forestry being done in cocoa. It's a planting design in cocoa, which qualifies as regenerative, which means, among other things, it's returning carbon to the soil. The soil has gone from roughly 0.5% organic matter to 5% organic matter over the course of the 5 to 10 years or so that some of these new plantings have been done, right? But Anthony makes the point here that even a highly efficient agroforestry system, or this is not an agroforestry system, even a highly efficient regenerative agriculture system, which is meeting the needs of regenerative agriculture, is not the same thing as if this were an old growth forest. So I think it's really important to understand the differences and to have in your mind pictures of what each one of these things means. So let me get back to the LinkedIn post and back to Anthony's points. Right. So again, what we're talking about old growth forests as one. We're talking about agroforestry as another. We're talking about regenerative agriculture as a third approach doing it. There are other approaches we can consider, but all of these become here what represents perhaps an ideal in terms of old growth forests, and then what can we do given economic and other constraints to be able to meet the market demands that have been created to produce the products, cocoa to turn into chocolate, and how do we balance those societal and social and environmental and economic risks. So for example, in Ecuador, where in the western coastal areas, cocoa trees are being planted in areas that were heavily deforested by the Spanish to build their armadas and to rebuild towns after fires. These are, however, largely monoculture farms, and that is true. If we look at the photo that I showed you, it's on the Hacienda Victoria. There are multiple monocultures in production on the same place. So it's not like the entire farm is CCN 51. I don't actually think there's much CCN 51 on this particular farm, but there is a variety of old Nacional varieties and other varieties on the farm. There are some new hybrids, T800, T801, which are on the farm as well. So it's not one huge monoculture. There are a bunch of smaller monocultures on the farm, but they are monocultures. And by definition, the carbon capture that are capable of, right, largely better than currently degraded grasslands, right, could be much higher through putting in place agroforestry systems, right? Especially diverse agroforestry systems can make a huge difference. If they have enough different canopies and diversity, they can definitely lead to significant carbon capture. However, much like the above, it's important to note that even a highly diverse agroforestry system pales in significance when compared to old growth tropical forests. So absolutely. But here's an interesting point, right? Is that we need to understand what we mean by agroforestry, what we say by agroforestry. And while there are some definitions for what agroforestry means, there is no single size fits all definition for what agroforestry means. And so we also need to understand not just what the carbon capture capabilities of these diverse agroforestry systems are, but what the economic impact of these diverse agroforestry systems are as well. And then what he does is he points to their 2020 paper on the topic. I'm going to take this and put it into the post on the Chocolate Life. I haven't done that yet, but the link will be in the post on the Chocolate Life. And then we'll be talking about something interesting, which is what is called multi-stakeholder initiatives. The Voice Network is a multi-stakeholder initiative. Mighty Earth is a multi-stakeholder initiative, and we'll get to that a little later. But then I want to jump to another colleague of mine, David Briceño Puentes. David is in Colombia, and what he says is, I think, an expansion. That's why I wanted to get to Anthony's talks first. So what David is saying is there are lots of different setups of cocoa crops in farming that people should keep in mind. It is not the same to say papaya farming, right, than cocoa farming, as the latter ranges from low to high density, no or heavy shading, timber forestry, diverse agroforestry, low yield, high yield, no input to heavy input, to name some variables. So absolutely. So when we're thinking about, okay, we've just accepted what any time that you cut down old growth forest anywhere in the world and you replace it with often a monoculture, so you're growing large quantities of the same crop, over vast areas, that you're going to have an impact on rain cycles. And you can completely change rainfall patterns around the world. So let's just take that as a given. I think it has been empirically proved that that is in fact the case. For people who may not want to believe it, I ask that you spend your disbelief and just go with an understanding that humans have an impact on the landscape through agriculture. And when the impact on the landscape through agriculture is large enough, and by what we mean is large enough in terms of the area that is involved, and large enough in terms of what is the difference between what was originally there and what is there now, right? We contribute, right? Humans contribute to changing climate patterns. Now, I'm not going into is it getting hotter, is it getting colder, is we just change things from the pattern that was there before the arrival of humans. So what it is that David is saying, and absolutely, some cocoa systems contribute more to climate change, and some could help to mitigate it. And I think mitigation is a really good word here, where we may not necessarily be able to solve the problem, but we're going to make the problem less bad than it is, right? So when it comes to the final question, what David is saying is that when we're thinking about how cocoa can help contribute to mitigating climate change, how can it be a solution to climate change, right? Crop performance is very poor in the vast majority of cocoa farms, which not only leads to very low yields, but to less resilient plants. So people must be wary about promoting zero input models. And what David is referring to here, a zero input or low input model, says if you don't invest a lot of labor in your farm, and you don't invest a lot in agricultural inputs, whether fertilizers or pesticides and things like that, right? You're going to get a low output. So you're going to get a low yield. And that makes a whole lot of sense. And it turns out that a lot of the cocoa farms out there in the world are, in fact, low input models. Right? The farmers do not spend huge amounts of time over the course of the year in their farms tending them. Right? It's a cash crop. They go into their farms, they pull stuff down as they need it, and they either sell the wet mass, or maybe they have enough volume to do their own fermentation on the farm, right? Or they're a member of cooperative and they can contribute to the cooperative. So, so when we think about cocoa as a solution to climate change, right? one of the things that David says he works for, and I think probably a better way of thinking about it is he looks for, right? Diverse forestry cover, where the forestry cover is not intended for exploitation. You're not going to cut down this forestry for lumber production, timber production. So higher cocoa density plantations to make better use of soil and depend less on area expansion and things like wood to make a profit. Better performing cocoa crops to increase yield, resilience, and harvest stability. Smaller and better organized plants to improve the ergonomics and to reduce the hardships of tending huge plants, which I would identify also as quite old plants in many cases. So what David is proposing here is something that I think becomes obvious, and I'm going to state it a little bit differently from the way David does when it comes to cocoa being a solution for climate change. And this is actually something that Anthony brought up, which is the cocoa production system that we have right now, for the most part, like the vast majority of cocoa, is produced by smallholder farmers. And that means it's extremely inefficient, right? Now, one of the reasons why it's still smallholder farming for the most part is that there is very little mechanization that can be done, right, on a cocoa farm as opposed to a soybean farm or in a vineyard, or if I'm corn or wheat or things like that. When we think about, the very large areas of wheat here in the United States, I mean, there are huge machines which are specially built, which go into the farms and, help manage every aspect of from planting to weeding to harvesting. And we would not be able to produce the quantities of agricultural products that we do without this kind of mechanization. However, cocoa, for the most part, resists all forms of mechanization. I mean, if there is one form of cocoa production that I think of gets mechanized, it might be pod breakers in after harvesting. So you put the pods into a machine, and they're much more efficient in terms of opening up the pods and extracting the beans. Although they often introduce bits of pod, and it's not perfect about getting rid of the placenta. And then there is no visual inspection of saying, oh, there are seeds in this pod which are diseased and shouldn't be included. So it works both ways. But I think the important thing to understand here is that for the most part, cocoa as a crop resists mechanization at all level until you put it into the fermentation box. And even in most cases, fermentation is not very highly mechanized. And so if we're looking about how cocoa contributes to climate change, in order to be able to get to the kind of volumes that we're looking for in a smallholder, for the most part, subsistence farming model, right? Then what happens is that when an area becomes lower and lower productivity, right? Often what will happen is what we do is we expand the amount of land. So we'll go to a new area, we'll cut it down, we'll plant cocoa, right? And this is one of the unfortunate aspects of cocoa as a crop, right? We can look to improved seeds to do a higher productivity variety. It's going to take 3 to 5 years for it to start to be productive. Whereas if I have a new variety of soybeans or a new variety of corn or a new variety of wheat, I can, quote unquote, improve the entire harvest the next year from seed, because I plant new seeds every year for those crops. They're annuals, not perennials. Actually, cocoa trees are perennials. And so there is a kind of inertia built into cocoa farming, which makes rapid change incredibly difficult. It also makes the cost of change incredibly expensive. But David has a really, really interesting point here, which is if what we do is we focus on more productivity in a smaller area, all right, so rather than saying, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a new kind of cacao tree, and on your hectare, you're now going to be able to produce twice as much cocoa, right? Because we have a much higher yielding. Maybe what we should think about is reducing the amount of cocoa that is being produced to a smaller bit of the land, making it reach a certain level of productivity from trees that are more disease resistant, more pest resistant, and higher yielding. And then what we do is we look at the rest of the land and we think about the rest of the land in a very different way. So if I have a 2 hectare farm, if I can produce the same amount of cocoa in 1 hectare, what can I do with the rest of the land, the other hectare? And can some of it be planted in a way that contributes to reducing the effects of climate change, right? Perhaps not when we think about it in terms of a single farm, but if we were to think about 1,000 farmers, all right, and we think about in the same part of the same state or province, and we can connect their land in some way, and it becomes a little bit more interesting. It's still expensive; it still takes years, right? But I think that part of the challenge that we have in making the changes that need to be made in order to get this done is this sort of fundamental tension that exists around the individual smallholder farmer and the primacy of the individual smallholder farm, and the fact that we don't have good forms of organization other than a legally constituted cooperative. Once we get from the individual smallholder farmer. And so there's something there. If what we can do is we can have, if we can, I'm going to go back to this picture here because I think it's a really, really good picture. What's interesting about this when I think about what David is saying is that number one is this is irrigated. So you can see drip irrigation lines. That's this line here. This is a drip irrigation line. It's right here. Let me go. This is drip irrigation. This is drip irrigation, which you can see here. But more interestingly, the trees are planted on mounds. So this is hillocks. In between, there is a place where leaves, which are pruned off the trees, can go, and so they're just allowed to decompose, and the organic matter get incorporated into the soil. But what you'll do is you'll notice that this is also looks like a vineyard. So the trees have been planted and they've been organized in a way, and there are in fact support lines like you would find for grapevines, which hold the trees flat. You'll notice that all of the branches are in a flat plane. They're in a plane which go from one end to the other, right? There are just 3 on every single one of them. You'll go look and say, we have three of these. And the rows are organized so that the sun gets to both sides of the trees. And what happens is that therefore there's a lot of sun energy for photosynthesis. What's not visible here and is a part of the planting system here, which is very, very important, is that these trees are pruned on a much more regular. So pruning often happens 2 times a year. They're pruned here at least 4 times a year. What happens is that that means there are a lot more immature leaves which are flushing. And it turns out that flushing leaves are much better at extracting CO2 out of the air. So there are a bunch of things going on here which need to be considered. But could we work with smallholder farmers to work with new planting patterns and new planting densities? I mean, these trees here never get more than about 8 feet, 3 meters tall. And so it turns out that it's really easy to prune the trees, and it's really, really easy to harvest off these trees. In terms of reaching in, everything is easily available. And I think that, again, David has something here in terms of could we think about different planting systems? Yay, right? Where we can produce. So this is a Nacional variety. Nacional typically has somewhere between 400 and 600 kilos per hectare. When planted traditionally, but in this environment, its productivity is about 2 metric tons per hectare, so somewhere between 3 to 5 times. So if we could reduce the amount of land which is necessary to produce the same amount of cocoa, by a factor of 50%, right? And we were then able to revert the other 50% of the land to other uses, one of which could be biodiversity corridors. Could they be used for, other forms of agroforestry, so that there was diversity in terms of the agricultural crops that were being produced, so the farmers did not necessarily have to rely just on cocoa for income. I mean, there are interesting things to think about here in terms of, okay, is our model of the individual smallholder farmer on their own plot the right one to consider? And this is where I think some of my experience working with Ingeman down in Nicaragua from 2014 to 2017, in terms of their farmer school, also connects. So when Ingeman works with farmers who are in their network, one of the things they do is they work with every farmer to help them understand their farm as a business. And so to think about, okay, this is what my farm is right now. What do I want my farm to be in 5 years? And to think about what the return they get from different crops is going to be, and how by reallocating land and reallocating labor on their farm, what they can do is they can be more profitable, earn whatever their business goals are. And then to also help them understand what the rate of return, the return of investment for labor and other things are in their farm, so they can say, well, I get a better return if I focus on this crop, or I get a better return focusing on this crop, or what is the best mix of these things, because I don't want to put figuratively all of my eggs in one basket. So I think this is interesting. I mean, this sort of farming that we're looking at here in Ecuador, which Anthony rightly calls out, this is a monoculture. There may be only 30 or 40 hectares in this particular plot. The next door plot, which might have a different planting system, is a different monoculture. It's a different cocoa variety. But what we're looking at is we're looking at a method of planting which meets all of the technical requirements for this to be called regenerative farming. And so one of the aspects of regenerative farming is to make sure that the soil is healthy, so that we can continue farming 100 years from now. I did point out to Andres Guzman, who's one of the owners of this farm, that one of the things that I thought was missing in what they're doing here is biodiversity corridors. That between one plot and another, there's not much space. There's usually just a road. And when they think about redesigning their farm or doing new planting in the farming, what they need to do is they need to allocate wide swaths, tens of meters, if not more, of land, and plant it in a way that does encourage not only bird life, but wildlife which runs along the ground. We did see some wild pigs while we were out here, but not as much as I would have seen. So there needs to be an incorporation into this planting approach, some consideration of other factors. When you go here, what you'll do is you'll see a couple of old sabo trees which have been left up for symbolic purposes, but for the most part, there's almost no shade. And the reason why there's almost no shade is because you can get more cocoa in the same amount of land when you produce this. When you produce this way, and if you're smart about it, you can use less water, and you can use less labor, and you can use fewer agricultural inputs. So for example, as you might imagine, they have no challenges whatsoever with fungal diseases in a place like this, because the humidity is kept in check, so they don't have to worry about it. Whereas if I was doing something under heavy shade, 40 to 50% shade, and I wasn't in a place where I had breezes every day, I would be worried about fungal diseases. Right? All of this is, the need to examine the system as a system, and not just take individual components. So we can't just focus on productivity. How do we produce more in less space? I mean, one of the things that Anthony has shown, research shows that just producing more cocoa in the same amount of land, if you have a bunch of farmers who are doing it, all it does is to drive down the price. And once you get above a certain level of productivity, everybody suffers. You have more cocoa, but everybody is losing money. And certainly that's not what it is that we want to be doing as a part of this, as you might imagine. So this is what's missing here is diverse forestry cover, right? But what he's got here is higher cocoa density plantations to make better use of the soil, better performing crops, and smaller and better organized crops. So I got 3 of the 4 things that you're looking for, David, here in terms of what's going on at the Hacienda Victoria. And I know from my conversations with them that as they expand, and they do have plans for expansion in the area, they are going to modify their planting approach to incorporating diverse forestry cover, which is not intended for felling. So he also then goes on. So, David, thank you very much for taking the time to answer this. I think it's really good. He has very little trust in certification standards in cocoa to make a difference. And this I heartily concur, right? So that if we look at multi-stakeholder initiatives, and Rainforest Alliance would be one of those. Organic certification is another example of that. I think the emerging standards around regenerative farming certification would be an example of a multi-stakeholder initiative, which is going to be perhaps more problematic than helpful in the long run. So number one, boom, setting aside the fact that certification audits, right, can be very easily manipulated. All certification standards, right, have a simple structural flaw, which is that they tend to be very specific when it comes to certain cosmetic changes, right, and not specific enough when it comes to structural changes on the farm. So a specific cosmetic change might be, oh, you need to certify that your kids go to school on weekdays. That's a cosmetic, which has nothing to do with whether or not you are in fact taking good care of your plants. A certification standard can tell you exactly and unequivocally how to perform safe handling and storage of pesticides for the farm. However, when trying to prove crop performance, standards will say stuff like farms must improve soil fertility. Okay, pruning is performed to improve overall performance. Water must be managed to increase certain objectives, water use efficiency. All those things are very specific and very technical, right? As for example, improving soil fertility is specific for every soil and farm condition, and pruning is a hugely important task in cocoa with very specific and technical requirements. And this is a discussion that I had with Heather Terry. Heather, some of you may know from previous episodes of The Chocolate Life, is a founder of Good Sam Foods, and I was in Colombia last July, as a matter of fact, visiting what they're doing, and we had this specific discussion about regenerative agriculture certification and standards. And we saw, cocoa farms in 2 very, very different parts of the country. And what we immediately understand is that what a cacao farm needs in order to be certified regenerative, in the plain, between Monteria and Necoclí, in the, I suppose it's this upper Midwest part of Colombia. We're looking on the coast between north of Medellin and Santa Marta, on that part of what a cacao farm needs to be certified regenerative in that part of the country is going to be very, very different if it's up in the foothills in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta or someplace like that. And if you have a single regenerative standard for all crops across all kinds of growing regions and growing conditions, then by definition, they're all going to be very, very broad in ways that probably don't mean much. And they're all going to be very, very specific in ways that make it very, very difficult on a crop by crop basis and a region by region basis to actually find out if you're being regenerative. And so I'm sort of wary about the regenerative, the growth to create these regenerative agriculture certification efforts, because I want to see what it is that they actually come to bring to market. So David's were the most recent. So Brigitte is asked a very interesting question as well, which I think that a lot of people like to know about, want to know about, but are sort of confused about. And so what does it mean when we talk about carbon credits and things like that? So I'd be interested to know how many cocoa growers are actively selling quality. So that's another issue. What is the quality of the carbon credits? What sort of difference it's making to them and their workers? There's a lot of mixed messages following carbon credit markets, greenwashing, some dedicated people working on life cycle credit models. Are there reliable sources where one could learn about cacao carbon credits? So I did a little bit of research, Brigitte, if you're watching. And what you can do is if you go to the Chocolate Life and the post for today's live stream, what you'll do is you'll see that I inserted a file that you can download. It's down here. It's called Cacao Carbon Summary 5.2 PDF. And so this is one study that I found about cacao, coffee, and carbon agroforestry systems and carbon markets. You may find some information there that answers your question. But I want to let you know, everybody know that I did some of the research in that area. And then I also did some research. There's a file you can download about the effectiveness of multi-stakeholder initiatives. And so it's really, really important that you go take a look at it. And you can find out why things like perhaps the World Cocoa Foundation or the Cocoa and Forest Initiative or Rainforest Alliance or FLO for Trade, Fair Trade, why multi-stakeholder initiatives like them are not delivering the kind of results that we might expect them to. It's really, really, really eye-opening read. So Nick Saxby, Cocoa Runners in the UK, people don't know. I mean, it's a great source for lots of different craft chocolate bars. I'm a big fan of what Cocoa Runners does, as well as Spencer Hyman, who I've been on panels with a number of times. Nick Saxby says, in the craft chocolate world, there's sometimes a bit of challenge in validating and validating or backing up your claims. Absolutely. Transparency reports do a good job of showing financial equity in the value chain. And Nick, I would say, prove it to me. Prove to me that transparency reports do a good job of showing financial equity, right? I have done an analysis of some of the uncommon cacao reports, specifically to the 2018 report, by taking all of the data in the PDF and scraping it and putting it into a spreadsheet and doing an analysis on it. And I don't necessarily agree with you that transparency reports do a good job of showing financial equity. I would point everybody to the Tony Chocolonely, what they call FAIR reports. They don't call them annual reports. They don't call them transparency reports. They're using loaded language. This is our FAIR report, right? And I would challenge anybody to go take a deep dive into any one of the recent annual reports, the FAIR reports of Tony's Chocolonely, and say that they're doing a good job of showing financial equity in the value chain. They do not. In fact, I think if you do a close analysis, they would show you that, as a matter of fact, they do the reverse. But I will agree on the next statement, which says, it seems to be way harder to communicate environmental impact in an evidence-based way. Absolutely. I mean, as hard as it is to say we are delivering financial equity to our farming partners, right? That's really hard to demonstrate in a way that people can easily research for themselves and can come to their own conclusions and say, yes, no matter how I look at this, I can say that there is equity in your chain here, right? But what do we mean when we say we're doing a good job for the environment? Now, I think that I'll have to go look for this. I had a conversation at Chocoa, I think in 2021, around this topic, and I think I have a couple of the original Beans reports that talk about this. And I think if anybody is doing a really good job in terms of trying to communicate what they're doing, in terms of reporting, I think that Original Beans is that company that I've seen. I'll have to go look for it. But it is really, really challenging. What do we mean? Because we're looking at environmental impact and we're looking at it as a topic separately from financial equity. So we have this whole thing, ESG, environment, sustainability, and governance. We need to be thinking of these things at a systems level. These things are not independent, they are interdependent, right? And so the economics of these things, and what I would say the fourth pillar of sustainability is sustainable markets. We need people to pay for doing all this work. And if we don't have people who are willing to pay to do all this work, right, I don't think, trying to finance it from the taxes on consumers trying to finance it through NGOs who are doing this through donations. I don't think that's the way to do it. We need to make industry, who is benefiting from maintaining the status quo, having them find a way to pay for this solution. It may mean that as consumers, we need to pay a little more. But I think that the challenge, Nick, around communications is getting them to understand why it's important to understand that we don't have an alternative but to pay more. That always thinking about chocolate is something that should be inexpensive. It's our birthright for chocolate to be inexpensive. As it's our birthright for, in the United States anyway, most people think that most food should be inexpensive, sold at less than the cost of production. It doesn't make sense in the long term. And so I think that's part of the communication issue that we need to get to. It's not necessarily about validating economic claims or financial equity claims. It's not about just environmental claims. It's about, we all live in this world together and we are all dependent on each other. None of us is independent of the environment around us and the people around us, and the environment around us may be something which is half a world away that is affecting me right now. So he does carbon credit markets are a bit of a Wild West. It does seem to have the shape of a solution for baking in carbon impact in a tangible, measurable way, which rewards farmers. And here's another place where I would say no, right? I don't think that there is a carbon credit market anywhere in the world which is accessible to an individual smallholder farmer. If I am a big estate holder farmer, like the Hacienda Victoria in Ecuador, then yes, I might be able to go out and participate in a carbon credit market because I have 200, 300, 500 hectares of cocoa, and I can document my ability to sequester carbon, right, in the soil. And that's not something that an individual farmer is going to be able to do. We can't have a carbon credit market where we're parceling it down to the 2-hectare level around the world. I don't think it's going to work. So I think that the carbon credit markets, as they are currently constructed, may work for big industrial scale producers, but I don't think they work for individual smallholder cocoa farmers. And this is one of the challenges, is that as an industry, what we've done is we've continued to think about the smallholder farmer as the only way to get this work done, or the smallholder farmer on the traditional smallholder farm as the way forward, that there's a primacy there. This is what we need to protect. And that may be the bit of thinking that needs to change in order to do it. But Nick, got to say, I do not believe that carbon credit markets for smallholder farmers is ever going to work. Brigitte, come back. Implementing, assessing, and reporting carbon impact in the field is complex and complicated. Yeah, and who's going to do that, and who's going to pay for it? It's not the farmer, and the farmer's not going to do it unless they're paid for it, right? And they're not going to pay for it based on, they're going to get an incremental carbon credit. How are they going to spend that carbon credit? How are they going to use it? What a use of it is to a farmer with 2 hectares, on the other side of the Andes range from Guayaquil. Tell me about those things. Let's think about, okay, how can I leverage the carbon credit market to be successful for an individual smallholder farmer? How do we go do that, right? And we can start having the discussion about whether there's the time, energy, resources, capital resources that growers and makers do not have, right? So, Brigitte, absolutely. Right. So in my area, some farmers are receiving money from carbon credits. I would guess, David, please let me know if I'm wrong if you're watching this, that these are not individual smallholder farmers. These are people who are in a group, and the group is selling the carbon credits. Everyone gets the same amount of money because carbon fixation is estimated regardless of the specific farming systems, right? So you could have 2 farmers. One is much more productive than another. They have the same amount of land, but the way it works is there's a fixed amount of money which is given, and the farmers figure out how to split it among themselves. A farmer that does a better job at carbon fixation is not rewarded more for the work that he's doing, as opposed to some other member of the group who may not be doing as good a job. As we pointed out, at the moment, it is too little money to make a meaningful difference. And I think we've had this discussion before. We need to be thinking about meaningful differences, tangible differences. And it is unclear what would happen with shade trees, as most new areas in Colombia are intended for, okay, so we're out of the realm of cocoa, but he's talking about carbon credits have in a timber forestry system. So what they're doing is they're growing the trees. While the trees are growing, they're sequestering carbon, but then they sell the wood, right? And for building or other reasons. And so in long term, we're not getting the kind of sequestration that we're happening in order to make it have a serious impact over the long term. Nick, thanks. I'm having fun with these conversations. I like doing the research. I like thinking through these. I like talking back and reacting to the comments that other people have got. Yeah, cocoa farming contributes to climate change. All commercial activity does, at least indirectly. I would say all commercial activity does directly in one form or another, but it certainly matters what farming methods use and what else happens in the value chain. So we need more agroforestry. We know that greater biodiversity, particularly in trees and landscape, make more effective carbon sinks, right? But what form of agroforestry does this? What management system best does this? Cacao, by its nature, can be grown in relative harmony with otherwise undisturbed tropical forests. And one way of describing that system in Brazil is called cabruca, which I do mention in a later comment. Cabruca can be grown in relative harmony with an otherwise undisturbed tropical forest, but it's not agriculturally ideal. So agriculturally ideal. Why is it not agriculturally ideal? Number one is anytime you grow cocoa under dense shade, the ability of the cocoa tree to use what light filters down to it to grow fruit is severely impaired. And so while the tree is growing under this shade, it tends to be very, very low performance, compared with other farming techniques. The other one is that in a forest, the trees are not planted in any particular design. So in a cacao farm, everything might be on a 3x3 triangle or a 4x4 rectangle, or you might have a 2x1 or a single line system. And there are lots of different ways to organize the planting, right? But if you're under big trees, then the cacao trees are all over the place. And so not only is the planting density low and the trees are inefficient, but getting to those trees, it can be a challenge navigating through all of the other things which are growing. So there's a whole spectrum of management techniques from harvesting wild cacao, right, to big full sun high productivity haciendas. There's some evidence for agroforestry systems improving productivity, some evidence, a lot of evidence compared to low shade, high input system, but there's usually a trade-off between high carbon land management and economic productivity. Perhaps another reason to redefine cocoa's true value, and I would agree. Right now, we're focused on what is the value of the dry seed, right? And that's established in a market exchange, which can be manipulated. And so we don't tie any of the other elements that we've come to value. So could we say cocoa that has a lower carbon footprint we should pay more for? Does cocoa which preserves shade? I mean, these are all really difficult things to quantify, but should we be thinking of them in order to be able to find a way to better value cocoa and value not just price cocoa? I mean, Nick, really, really interesting questions. And I think there are things that we need to go back and take a look at with this. I do mention agroforestry, and then there's another system which, again, nobody was mentioning cabruca, which I thought was interesting. If you're in Brazil, you know anything about the Mata Atlântica, so the Atlantic rainforest, which is the second largest rainforest in South America after the Amazon, just as the Orinoco River system is the second largest river system after the Amazon. If you look at the Mata Atlântica and you look at cabruca, what can it do? And there are different forms of cabruca. We need to understand. I've seen wildly different examples of planting density and shade cover and have it so-called cabruca. But one of the things that we haven't talked about, we've always been talking about agroforestry, and we weren't talking about a larger system, which in Spanish is called agropecuaria, which includes the deliberate introduction of animals. So for example, could you use chicken and pigs as a part of an agroforestry system. You would, there are lots of reasons that animals can be very, very positive contributors when it comes to fertilizer and things like that. So Anthony, kudos. You're not an expert on Kabruka systems. I'm not. I'm not either. To make clear value judgment there. What it is that I do know just about it says that while Kabruka may be a part of a solution in a part of the world, it is not necessarily the solution everywhere in the world. And I think that there are also, yeah, I mean, we need to consider that when we do that. So agroforestry, including animals, makes sense as animals provide some, if not all, of the necessary fertilizer. Important to find the right balance, though, as most livestock are invasive species and don't always play well with local flora and fauna. Absolutely. So we're not talking about industrial farming. I'm not talking about, which is also something that Anthony mentions. They're talking about the context of smallholder farmer, not large scale animal husbandry. Whether you're a vegan or a vegetarian, right? And if I'm a smallholder farmer, I may not have the luxury of making that decision for me. And so having animals which produce meat for my family or for sale, milk and eggs, right, in terms of diversified income stream, are really, really important. And then animals can be valuable contributors on the farm as well. And that's, for the most part, the comments that are here that I've received. And what I really, really thank everybody who answered these questions. And I am really, really excited and happy to be able to get this feedback from the community. I'm throwing the questions out there. They may seem like softball questions. I can assure you that none of these are softball questions. They're things that I've been looking at for a long time. I'm looking to reach out, get a bunch of different opinions about, and just help me understand. So as a communicator, and to see if there are ways that what I can do is I can take what it is that I know about this and find more efficient, more compelling ways to communicate about issues like cocoa and climate change. What is quality? And things like that. And so, when I'm really excited, because we're, boom, it's, at the end of the hour, we've got there. So that's, always just astonishing to me that we get through all the way to the end of an episode. But I want to point out a couple of things. First is that this episode of The Chocolate Life is brought to you by the sponsors of The Chocolate Life, by the members of The Chocolate Life. If you're not a member, please go. I'm logged in at the moment. There's a little button up here. If you're not logged in, it'll say join. Click on it. There's always a free member. So, I appreciate your joining. There are also paid membership levels if you do have the resources to support The Chocolate Life in that way. It's very, very greatly appreciated. And while you're on LinkedIn, go and connect with me on YouTube, like the channel, subscribe the videos, like the videos, subscribe to the channel so you'll get notifications, and we can grow this. And please share, whether you're watching on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, share with your community. It is very, very much appreciated to go and help grow what it is that we're doing here. And finally, what I want to say is that I've got what I think is a really interesting topic for this coming Friday's live stream. So that's Friday, July 7th. And that is around Tony's Chocolate Only. So, many people, I don't know how many people know, but of the actor Stephen Fry and then the author Christopher Hitchens, but about a decade ago, they were involved in a symposium in the UK where the notion was resolved. The Catholic Church is a force for good in the world. It's really, really fascinating, and you can learn a lot about arguing opinions on both sides. That's one of the reasons why I was attracted to that particular debate, was to learn about different debate styles. Christopher Hitchens and Stephen Fry are just, I think, remarkable speakers, very, very articulate, no matter what side of what topic they're talking about. And so this coming Friday's live stream, that's Friday, July 7th, is going to be resolved. Tony's Chocolate Only is a force for good in the world. Now I'm going to be posting this on LinkedIn sometime in the next, maybe later today, early tomorrow morning, and I'll put, I'll notify people. But I would like you to go in and answer that question either on the yay or on the nay, right? Is Tony's Chocolonely a force for good in the world? And on Friday, we'll be back on the Chocolate Life Live to be discussing what that means, right? And with that, everyone, it's the 4th of July here in the United States. I thank everybody who's taken time out of their holiday to spend time with me today, whether you're here in the US, no matter where you were in the world, and to remind everybody, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, I think you're doing it wrong. So until the next time, ciao, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you in the Chocolate Life Live in the future.